But in Brazil, space, climate, and ESG are not just peripheral issues. They are the most politically legitimate justification for in-space investment. When you talk with the government authorities about the space, this is for them, this is for the most important. Satellites are seen not just as abstract technology, but really essential tools for protecting forests, resources, respond to disasters, and support evidence-based public policy.
Hey, SpaceWatchers, and welcome back to Space Café Radio. We are recording this episode at the very beginning of 2026, the perfect moment to pause, reflect, and ask where the global space sector is really heading. And my guest today is Ian Grosner, the General Counsel of the Brazilian Space Agency and the Workgroup Chair at UN Copius. And for the long-term listeners of you, a very familiar voice. Because during the pandemic years, Ian was the host of our Space Café Brazil series. Of course, in Portuguese, so I didn't understand the word, but I trust him fully. And he was guiding us through Brazilian space ambitions at a time when the world and the space policy was in flux. Today, Ian is the General Counsel of the Brazilian Space Agency. And hey, folks, see where SpaceWatch can bring you. Ian, great to have you back at Space Café. So how are you doing today?
Thank you so much, Torsten. Thank you for the invitation. It's great to be here. Familiar faces and SpaceWatch. So yes, it's great. And thank you and Happy New Year for everyone and especially for SpaceWatchers.
Thank you very much. So today we are looking back to 2025. What was the single most important shift in Brazil's and, to give it a broader scope, Latin America's space sector?
Yes, thank you. Thank you for the question. In my opinion, the most important shift in 2025 was this clear transition from a state-centered technology-driven space model to a use-driven market-oriented one. Space moved from a long-term ambition and institutional planning into day-to-day decision-making in agriculture, climate policy, infrastructure, finance, and security. In practical terms, space stopped being just about space and started being about outcomes on Earth. And this marked the culture change here in our region. Success was no longer measured by launches or hardware milestones alone, but by especially who was using space data, how often, and for what economic or strategic purpose.
Maybe you can explain it a bit more, what it meant for Brazil. And also, was this change driven more by policy, by market demand, or at the end by the geopolitical reality?
Well, in fact, in reality, it was driven by a combination of all of three. But I think, in my opinion, market demand was the decisive factor here. Agribusiness in general in Brazil and in Latin America, it's really strong. Climate, finance, insurance, and global supply chains began requiring reliable, continuous space-based data, not as innovation, but as necessity. So public policy helped to remove some barriers and legitimize use case while geopolitics add urgency around sovereignty and data control, for example. But together, these three pillars and these three factors, they pushed the sector post-experimentation into irreversibility, as I say.
I think one of the parts that we can then connect to policy is what we call the new space economy. And we often say new space, but what does that actually mean in Brazil today as we move into this new year? So is there a new space economy already existing? So can you give us some insight on that?
Yes, in my perspective, in Brazil, new space, this term, right, in 2026, it's no longer centers on who owns satellites or launch systems. It increasingly means how space capabilities are converted in economic value, public service, and developed outcomes. The emphasis has shifted from infrastructure ownership to access, application, and integration of space-derived data across the economy. Clear example of shifts in Brazil involvement in this area is this space economic initiative led by UNIOSA in partnership with Brazilian Space Agency and United Nations Development Program, UNDP. This initiative reframes space as enabler of sustainable development and economic growth, linking satellite data to practical use cases in agriculture, urban development, climate resilience, and risk management. That perspective closely reflects how Brazil is now approaching space policy as a tool embedded in broader economic and social system, not as a standalone technological ambition.
Can you allude a bit more on that? I understand is that you're not looking after as you mentioned earlier, the hardware and producing satellites and getting your own assets into space, but more into using data, using results, using solutions from others that you're buying from the market rather than to develop it on your own. Is correct summarized?
Yes.
Using satellite data, yes, but not homegrown, used or from others.
Yeah, because the satellites are increasingly inputs rather than sources of value. Hardware is capital intensive and slow to scale, while data, when combined with analytics, AI, and domain expertise, can be reused, adapted, and monetized continuously. The Space Economy Initiative reinforces this logic by prioritizing downstream applications, capacity building, and market creation, rather than focusing solely on national hardware capabilities. What I'm telling is, it's not just to do one or another, it's to do both. But I think, in my opinion, the focus right now, it's more on data and how to use these downstream systems than the hardware itself. For Brazil, it's a strategic choice here. The country does not need to manufacture every satellite to be a meaningful space sector. It needs to secure reliable data access, build strong analytical ecosystems, and integrate space-based insights in priority sectors of the economy. In 2026, for example, new space in Brazil is therefore less about what is launched into orbit and more about how space intelligence is applied on Earth.
Interesting. But let's start from the LEO economy. Small satellites constellation have become a very dominant model also in your region. So there are a number of companies in South America, Latin America, that are running their constellations. Why does this approach work so well for emerging space economies? Is it because of the speed of availability or the quality of data or not having all the burden from the old days carrying with you? So what is it?
I think it's a mix, many elements. Yes, small satellites work well in my opinion, for emerging space economies like ours because they combine technical feasibility, financial realism, and strategic learning. I think especially because their lower costs and shorter development cycles reduce risk and allow, for example, governments, universities, and companies to move from theory to practice much faster than old big satellites. This makes space programs more resilient and less dependent on long political or budgetary cycles. So just as is important, small satellites play a critical, especially educational and capacity building role here in our region. Across Brazil and Latin America countries, CubeSats and microsatellites have become hands-on training platforms for engineers, scientists, and as well for space policy specialists. They allow students and early career professionals to participate in the full space mission lifecycle: design, integration, launch, operation, and data use, something that large satellite programs rarely offer at scale.
And are these small satellites also produced in Brazil? Because when I remember correctly, in the Space Café Brazil whatever I could pick up from that. So we talked with people from INPE, if that was the institute, or Alia Satellites, or so. There were high ambitions to go that path. So what is the reality today?
What I'm trying to tell here, Brazil is not to bring just small satellites or constellation of small satellites. But in our reality, come on, it's easier, and it's especially for budget constraints. It's more realistic approach, right, to use and produce small satellites. But even though Brazil still have problems, for example, CBERS and other programs with INPE to use and produce big satellites as well. But of course, you have more time to do that. You need to have more money, budget to do this. So it's a little more complex when you see in medium or a long term, right? So that's why, especially for industry right now, because we can use, for example, today, some data with the same precision or even better using a small satellite that we use a big satellite in the past, for example.
But can you tell us a bit about your or Brazil's experience with programs like CBERS or Amazonia 1? I also found, and you mentioned before the educational part, that students are working on the satellites, but ultimately, as a student, you want to see them fly because that makes you proud. So you don't want to just build it for the bin or for the shelf.
Exactly. This is the great thing about especially small satellites, because we have, for example, 8 universities here in Brazil, aerospace engineering courses. It's feasible. That's something you have, as you mentioned, you do everything. And for educational purposes, it's great. But answering specifically about how, for example, CBERS and Amazonia 1 shaped this in mindset, for our experience, this both has been fundamental. Programs like CBERS demonstrate the long-term value for institutional continuity and international cooperation, something really important in the space sector, right? International cooperation. At the same time, Amazonia 1 reinforced the importance of national capability and data sovereignty. 2 different things, but really important to change this mindset here. So small satellites programs building these lessons by adding a strong human capital dimension. They create a pipeline of trained professionals who understands both the technical and operational realities of space system. In this sense, in my opinion, small satellites are not just cost-effective tools, but they are capacity-building instruments, really powerful. They help the region to move from the dependence to competence and from isolated projects to sustainable space ecosystem.
Okay. Let's move on to the launch site, literally. So Alcântara is very well known and it's often described as a globally strategic launch site. But strategy alone doesn't guarantee success. So where does it really stand today?
In my particular opinion, Alcântara has moved sizably from just one promise to real operational reality. By the end of 2025, it demonstrates that Alcântara is ready to host international and commercial launch operations with the necessary technical infrastructure, safety protocols, and institutional coordination in place. In this context, I mentioned that AAB, Brazilian Space Agency, and the Brazilian Air Force work together in coordination for the flights, for example. The conversations, in my opinion, it's no longer about readiness, but about scale, cadence, and long-term positioning in a competitive global launch market.
Absolutely.
We are ready, I think, especially for small satellites.
And correct me if I'm wrong, that by end of 2025, there was a successful launch of a launcher in space by South Korea. Is that correct?
Yes, the launch itself, it was made in flight. And after some seconds, they have to explode the launch vehicle. But the launch itself, in our perspective for a launch site, was okay, was a success. Of course, the launcher and the vehicle was gone, but in our perspective for the launcher site, everything worked as we expected.
So no damages on the launch site? So the launch pad was not destroyed by the launch. So that was cleared. So similar what we saw with ISA Aerospace, they cleared the pad and then...
The pad is intact. Everything is okay. And of course, it's undergoing investigation about the incident, of course, but it's normal. It's in the protocols and it's everything okay there.
Yeah. Question about that. Should we judge then Alcântara primarily as a commercial launch site or as a sovereign national capabilities? Because you mentioned earlier also the Air Force is using it and so on. Or is it something in between? How would you judge it?
No, it should be judged as both. It's a clear understanding that it's a commercial viability and also strength sovereignty, not the opposite. It's for both purposes. And of course, this one was a totally commercial launch. That's why Brazilian Space Agency was there, because Brazilian Space Agency is the city authority for space sector here in Brazil. So we were there. In our perspective, this launch center can attract regular international customers as we did this last year. And there's no problem. And in this sense, Alcântara's role as commercial hub is what will ultimately sustain its value as a sovereign national capability. But trying to answer your question, it is both.
Okay, understood. Let's have a look at the private space sector or the startups in Brazil. And we touched it a bit earlier on. So maybe you can give us an overview. So what the health sector is of the Brazilian space startup ecosystem and what are the obstacles there? Is it technology? Is it scaling? Is it funding? Is it access to customers at the end of the day? Or again, all of the above?
Exactly. You pointed very well. The ecosystem is clearly healthier and more mature than it was a few years ago. But of course, it is still very much work in progress. We are seeing better business models, strong integration with non-space sectors, and a gradual shift for grant-dependent projects to revenue-generated companies. That said, the ecosystem is relatively small, fragmented, and uneven across the region. But I have a concrete example here of progress. Idea Space, a startup from Brazil, the city where I am here. Idea Space has evolved from a nationally focused company into one with international operations and customers in countries such as Azerbaijan, Saudi Arabia, and India. And it's incredible. Its trajectory shows that Brazilian space startups can move beyond pilots and proofs of concept to deliver competitive services globally, especially in downstream applications, analytics, and mission support. And for example, the main business for ID Space, for example, is space education, right? And it's incredible what they are doing right now there. And now they can export the projects and everything for other countries. It's great.
If you size the market or the sector in Brazil, so about how many companies and how many employees are we talking about? Do you have an order of magnitude?
Yeah, honestly, I don't have an answer for it because as Brazilian Space Agency, we're still working and put everything together because we have both models here. We have the old companies, the big ones, the Brazilian and the startup companies. And we are trying to see how Brazil is doing in the space economy sector. And that's why I previously mentioned this project between Brazilian Space Agency, UNOSA, and UNDP. And we are still developing this working space economy exactly to reach and try to answer your question.
Okay. You're clearly on the ramp up phase of the sector, period.
The sector, yes.
Let's connect a bit space, climate and ESG. Brazil plays a central role in global climate work, as we have just seen at COP or in your country, but also in terms of environmental monitoring. So how has that translated into economic and strategic relevance through space? And I'm not sure, but I believe there is a project together with Planet about the rainforest monitoring and to get hold of the people that are deforesting illegal.
Yeah. I honestly don't know this specific project because we have our own projects, governmental projects to dealing with it. But in Brazil, space, climate, and ESG are not just peripheral issues. They are the most widely accepted and I can say politically legitimate justification for in-space investment. When you talk with the government authorities about the space, this is for them, this is for the most important. In my opinion, for both governments and civil society, environmental monitoring represents the clearest, most tangible public value of space capabilities. Satellites are seen not just as abstract technology, but really essential tools for protecting forests, resources, responding to disasters, and support evidence-based public policy. And this translated into significant strategic relevance. And that's why, for example, Amazonia 1 that I told before, it's really important for us, not just because it was the first really national 100% technology and satellite built, but for the results and what we can see. And of course, this has strong link, for example, for open data policy in Brazil to demonstrate and to see deforestation and everything, not just about Amazonia, but for entire country.
Let's shift gears a bit. Space is increasingly linked to sovereignty and security. At least we see that here in Europe as a very strong focus in the last 12 months and in the years to come. So how openly is this reality acknowledged in Latin America today, with ground stations from other nations in the country or in the region, or based on current activities? So how safe are you feeling?
Yes, as you mentioned, around the world, space now is recognized critical infrastructure, right? Directly linked to national sovereignty, but as well economic resilience and security. Latin America is part of the broader shift, but recent regional developments have made the importance of space even more concrete and immediate. In our region, events related to border security, illegal mining, drug trafficking, maritime surveillance, and disaster response demonstrate that space assets are essential not only for civil purpose, but also for defense, border patrol, crime prevention, and situational awareness. Space data has become a practical tool for daily security operations, not just as a strategic concept.
Okay, so how does the government, and you're part of the government, balance the civilian, the commercial, and the dual-use interest without losing trust or transparency? That must be a pretty hard job.
Yeah, no, the challenge is compounded by structural reality, right? Space budgets in general in Latin America are extremely limited compared to global peers. This constraint forced governments to rely heavily on dual-use systems, shared civil military infrastructure, and international partnerships. While efficient, this model requires strong governance to maintain transparency and public trust. Right? So the balance that you asked depends on clear legal framework, civilian oversight of data use, and open communication about objectives and limits. In this context, governance becomes the decisive factor. A useful reference here is the Brazilian Space Act, which explicitly recognizes the dual-use nature of space activities and clearly distinguish what falls under civil use, what is defense use, and what is shared dual-use applications. Clarity is essential in a region where budgets are limited and system must serve multiple purposes.
I see. I invite you now on a journey. So let's travel to the end of 2026 in our time capsule and look back to 2026. So how would success look like for this Brazilian space sector now for us?
Success by the end of 2026 would not be defined by a launch or ambition, new programs, in my opinion, but by strategic alignment between plans, resource, and execution. Brazil right now is currently review its long-term space strategy, the PNI 2022 to 2031. And this year represents a critical opportunity to recalibrate that plan to reflect operational reality, especially the likelihood of constrained budgets for the years ahead. This is the reality. We don't have big budgets to put in everything that we planned in practical. That's why it's important to recalibrate and try to understand what is the most important to do in the next years. And this is the reality right now.
Yeah. Can you give us an order of magnitude about the space budget that the government is able to spend or is planning to spend this year?
It's less than 100. No, honestly, I don't know in reality how much we have, because of course we have one part to pay for personnel and everything, and of course another part to invest. And this part to invest is shortened every year. But honestly, I don't have a straight answer to you. How much is it?
Okay, good. Then maybe you can help us with the last question. So what is this one signal you would watch that tells you Brazil and Latin America have truly arrived in the global space economy? So what is this, maybe one event, one signal from the market, or is there anything on the horizon that you see?
I don't see one specific. Maybe for the clear signal here would be consistency. When Brazil and Latin American countries demonstrate that you can sustain space program, service, and partnerships despite the budget constraints, and when it's revised at the long plan terms, those countries will have crossed a critical threshold, in my opinion. So at the point, Brazil and Latin America will not be seen as promising space sectors, but as reliable ones. In the global space economy, reliability and continuity matter more than scale, and 2026 could be a rare chance to lock that in.
Great. Ian, thank you very much for your very honest answers. I really appreciate that. And our listeners are too, I assume. And I wish you and the Brazilian Space Agency and people in the sector a very happy new year and great success for 2026. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Torsten. Thank you, Space Watch. It's my pleasure to be here in 2026 for everyone. Thank you so much.
Thank you. If you like these or other episodes of Space Café Radio, leave us a rating on your preferred podcast platform. It is the currency of today. And if you want to stay on the pulse of the space industry, please visit our website at www.SpaceWatch.Global and subscribe to our newsletters. And of course, don't forget to become a Space Watcher. I'm Torsten Triening, publisher at SpaceWatch.Global. Your independent perspective on space.